Something happened this morning that has no real precedent in the history of this conflict. Not a strike on a military base, not a missile intercepted over Tel Aviv, not a fire at a fuel depot that's controlled in 2 hours and forgotten by evening. What happened this morning was a coordinated strike package designed to hit every system that keeps a modern nation functioning at the exact same time. The power grid, the water infrastructure, the energy refineries, the communications networks, the strategic military installations, all of it, simultaneously, and enough of those missiles got through. Israel right now is not dealing with damage. It is dealing with collapse, the kind that happens when every system that would normally compensate for the failure of another system is itself among the failures. That is not an accident. That is not random. That is a calculated military strategy. And in the next several minutes, I'm going to show you exactly what was hit, what the actual damage looks like versus what both sides are claiming, why Israel's air defense is under more pressure right now than at any point in this war, and what all of it tells us about where this conflict is genuinely headed. The missiles were launched from Iranian territory. That is confirmed, not disputed, and not a matter of interpretation. What they targeted and what they actually damaged is where the picture gets more complicated. And more important to understand clearly, the Haifa oil refinery was struck. A fire broke out. Footage circulated across social media within minutes showing thick black smoke rising from the facility. Journalists in the region confirmed the fire was real. And that confirmation matters, because in a conflict where both sides routinely inflate damage claims and restrict damage evidence, independent visual confirmation of a specific strike is one of the few things you can actually anchor your understanding to. But here's the distinction that most of the coverage is glossing over. A refinery fire that is brought under control within hours is a serious event. It disrupts fuel processing capacity temporarily. It produces alarming imagery. And it feeds into the psychological objective of the strike, which is not just operational damage, it's the demonstration of reach and capability. A refinery fire that cannot be controlled and that destroys the core processing infrastructure permanently is a different category of threat entirely. The footage from Haifa this morning indicates the former. Real damage, real disruption, real impact on fuel supply, but not the catastrophic permanent destruction that some of the coverage implies. The same principle applies to the power grid. Intercepted debris from incoming missiles struck a power station in the Haifa area, triggering electricity outages across multiple districts. That is a confirmed, documented event. What it means operationally depends on the timeline of restoration. And that timeline is something neither side has an interest in reporting accurately. Israel doesn't want to advertise how long its infrastructure is down. Iran wants the outage to appear permanent. The reality sits somewhere between those two presentations, and that gap is something you need to hold in your mind every time you see a headline about this conflict. Here is what most coverage of this morning's strikes is missing entirely, and it is the key to understanding why this particular attack is strategically different from everything that came before it. When a country takes a hit to a single system, it compensates. Power goes out, you reroute through other nodes or bring up emergency generation. Water distribution gets disrupted, you bring in alternatives through open roads. A military facility takes damage, you fall back on redundant command infrastructure. Modern states are built with precisely this kind of resilience in mind, because they have been planning for exactly this type of threat for decades. What this morning's strike package was designed to do, and what a coordinated, simultaneous strike on multiple categories of infrastructure achieves, is eliminate that compensation mechanism entirely. When the power goes out and the roads are blocked and the water pumping stations are down and the communications networks are disrupted all at the same moment, there is nothing left to draw on. Each individual failure compounds every other failure. The emergency response that would normally address a power outage cannot coordinate because communications are down. The fuel supply that would normally support emergency generators cannot move because roads are blocked. The water that would normally flow through backup distribution cannot reach the pumping stations because those stations are running on electricity that no longer exists. This is what military planners call a cascade failure event, and it is specifically what Iran's strike package this morning was designed to produce. Not maximum damage to any single target, but simultaneous pressure on enough targets that the entire system of resilience collapses under the combined weight. The question of how completely that collapse materialized, and how long it lasts, is the operational question that the evidence available right now cannot fully answer. What the evidence can confirm is that the design intent of this attack was precisely this, and that intent reflects a significant escalation in the strategic sophistication of Iran's targeting doctrine. Before we go any further into what happened this morning, there is a framework you need to have in your head, because without it, you will be consuming misinformation from at least one side of this conflict, possibly both, and you will have no reliable way of knowing which claims to trust. This conflict is a two-fronted information war running in parallel with the military war. Every piece of information you see about what happened this morning, the damage assessments, the casualty figures, the infrastructure status reports, is being filtered through the strategic communication objectives of parties with direct interests in how you perceive the damage. Israel has legal frameworks in place that restrict what journalists and media organizations can publish about specific categories of military and infrastructure damage during active hostilities. These restrictions are not new. They have existed in some form throughout Israel's history as a state that has been in continuous conflict with its neighbors. They exist because Israel's leadership understands that detailed damage assessments published in real time give adversaries precise feedback on the effectiveness of their strikes and the location of surviving infrastructure. That is a legitimate security concern, but it means that the Israeli information environment during an active strike event has systematic gaps, and those gaps are not random. They are concentrated precisely in the categories of information that would allow an independent observer to accurately assess the operational impact of incoming fire. Iran's information operation is different in character but equally sophisticated and equally interested in shaping your perception of what happened. Iran has powerful incentives to claim maximum damage, regardless of what its missiles actually achieved. Every successful penetration of Israeli air defense systems that Iran can credibly document or claim serves the strategic objective of demonstrating Iranian military capability. Every infrastructure facility that Iran can credibly claim was damaged or destroyed serves the objective of undermining Israeli civilian morale and confidence in the government's ability to protect them. That does not mean everything Iran claims is fabricated. It means that Iranian damage claims are produced by an information system with strong structural incentives to maximize reported damage, and they need to be measured against independent verification rather than accepted because they were officially announced. What you are left with as someone trying to understand what is actually happening is the gap between what each side claims and what independent evidence, footage, journalist reports from the ground, satellite imagery, and independent casualty documentation can actually confirm. That gap is always present in this conflict, but it widens precisely when the stakes are highest, and today the stakes are about as high as they have been since this war began. There is one dimension of this morning's strikes that should be getting far more attention than it is, and understanding it changes the entire picture of how vulnerable Israel is right now. Israel entered this war with a missile defense system that is genuinely one of the most sophisticated in the world. The Iron Dome handles short-range rockets. David's Sling intercepts medium and long-range missiles that don't reach exo-atmospheric altitudes. The Arrow 3, developed jointly by Boeing and Israel Aerospace Industries, handles long-range ballistic missiles at altitudes beyond the Earth's atmosphere. On paper, that is a layered, comprehensive defensive architecture that covers virtually every category of incoming threat. The problem is that every interceptor fired is an interceptor that no longer exists in the stockpile, and Israel has been firing them at an extraordinary rate since this conflict began. The situation became impossible to ignore in mid-March when Semaphore reported, citing U.S. officials directly, that Israel had informed the United States it was running critically low on ballistic missile interceptors. This was not a rumor. This was not Iranian propaganda. This was sourced from American officials familiar with the intelligence published by a credible outlet, and significant enough that within days of the report, the Israeli government approved an emergency transfer of approximately $826 million to the Defense Ministry for urgent defense procurement. Think about what that number tells you. $826 million in emergency spending, approved under pressure, within days of a report that Israel's interceptors are critically depleted. That is not a government managing a routine resupply cycle. That is a government responding to a genuine capability crisis in the middle of an active conflict. The deeper problem is timeline. You cannot manufacture ballistic missile interceptors quickly. Israel's own defense ministry signed a deal with Israel Aerospace Industries in December 2025 to expand Arrow 3 production capacity, a deal that was clearly made in anticipation of exactly this kind of depletion scenario. But expanded production capacity does not mean immediate new inventory. The lead time involved in building precision interceptor missiles means that the gap between current depleted stockpiles and replenished stockpiles is measured in months, not weeks. Iran knows this. The pattern of Iran's missile launches, using cluster munitions added to incoming missiles to force multiple interceptor deployments against a single threat, has been specifically reported as a tactic designed to accelerate interceptor depletion. This is not random. Iran is deliberately burning through Israel's defensive capacity faster than it can be replaced, and this morning's strike package arrived at a moment when that defensive capacity is at its lowest point since this war began. That is the context for understanding why some of this morning's missiles hit what they hit. The filter is still there, it has not disappeared, but it is thinner than it has ever been. Any honest account of this conflict requires spending equal time on both sides of the strike exchange, And the picture on the Iranian side is one that has received substantially less coverage in Western media than it deserves. Since the U.S. and Israel launched Operation Roaring Lion on February 28, 2026, Israeli airstrikes have hit at least 8 districts of Tehran. They have struck Bandar Abbas, Shahrekord, Avaz, and multiple other cities across the country. The Israeli Air Force reported using over 1,200 bombs in the first 24 hours of strikes alone. By early March, more than 300 people had been confirmed killed in Iran, with civilian infrastructure, including hospitals, schools, and oil depots, documented as damaged. The geographic distribution of the damage in Iran reflects the nature of a sustained, precision-guided air campaign against a large number of dispersed targets across a country the size of Western Europe. Buildings have collapsed. Roads are covered in debris. The Bushehr nuclear power plant, Iran's sole operational civilian nuclear facility, has been struck 3 times since the conflict began. Steel plants in Isfahan and Khuzestan have had production halted. Iranian media reports that the Revolutionary Guard has been systematically targeted across its network of command centers, missile storage sites, and production facilities. The Red Crescent has reported that at least 1 residential building in Tehran has been struck by Israeli airstrikes, with rescue teams working through rubble to reach survivors. Israeli officials maintain their targets are military command centers and weapons facilities. The gap between those two accounts, targeted military facilities versus residential buildings hit, is precisely the kind of disputed factual claim that needs to be assessed against independently verifiable evidence rather than the official statement of either party. What is not in dispute is the scale of the damage accumulated across Iran over 30-plus days of continuous strikes. The destruction is real, it is widespread, and it is in many respects more extensive in absolute terms than what has occurred in Israel, largely because Israel's air defense, even in its depleted state, has intercepted a meaningful proportion of incoming missiles. Iran has had no equivalent filter. Every Israeli bomb that was cleared to drop has landed. The most dangerous dimension of what is happening in this conflict right now is not the most visually dramatic. It is not the burning refinery footage or the missile impact craters in Tel Aviv. It is the slow, compounding civilian crisis that builds in the gaps between the strike events, the one that does not produce the kind of imagery that drives social media engagement. Modern states are deeply dependent on electricity for everything that keeps their civilian populations alive. Water pumping stations require electricity. Water treatment facilities require electricity. Hospitals require electricity. Communications networks require electricity. Food cold chains require electricity. When power infrastructure is disrupted at scale, every one of those dependencies becomes a vulnerability. In areas of Israel where power has been disrupted by this morning's strikes, water distribution has been affected, not because the water infrastructure itself was directly destroyed, but because the pumping stations that push water through the distribution network have lost power. This distinction matters for understanding the timeline of the crisis. A water access problem caused by power disruption resolves when power is restored or when emergency generation is brought to the affected pumping stations. A water access problem caused by direct physical destruction of water infrastructure resolves on a much longer timeline. The evidence from this morning points more toward the former than the latter, a serious but recoverable situation, not the permanent national-scale water paralysis that some of the most alarming social media reports have claimed. But the trajectory of this conflict is moving toward the latter. Iran's threat to irreversibly annihilate critical infrastructure across the Middle East, including essential water systems, was not a hypothetical. It was a direct response to Trump's threat to strike Iranian power plants. And it describes exactly the category of escalation that produces civilian crises that unfold over days and weeks rather than hours. The Gulf's desalination infrastructure is already in the crosshairs. Iran struck a desalination facility in Bahrain on March 8th. An Iranian strike hit a water desalination facility in Kuwait on March 30th, killing an Indian worker and causing significant structural damage. These are not incidents that resolve with a news cycle. Water scarcity in the Gulf is not an abstract concern. Desalinated water makes up approximately 90% of water resources across much of the region. Hitting desalination infrastructure is not a military strike. It is a humanitarian weapon. Given the volume of claims circulating about this morning's strikes and about the broader trajectory of this conflict, it is worth being direct about the specific categories of information that are being presented as confirmed when the evidence does not support them. The most widely shared claim that deserves serious skepticism is the assertion that Iran's strikes have produced a national-scale water crisis in Israel, including alleged dam failures and complete collapse of the national water distribution network. These claims spread rapidly on social media and were picked up by a number of outlets that presented them as confirmed. The evidence does not support the most extreme version. There are no confirmed official reports of a dam failure. There is no independently verified confirmation of complete national water system paralysis. What is confirmed is the power disruption to water pumping infrastructure in specific areas, which is serious but is categorically different from a structural collapse of the national water network. The second widely circulated claim that the evidence does not currently support is the assertion that a U.S. ground invasion of Iran has begun or is imminent. What the evidence does support is significantly more limited: increased American military activity in the region, troop positioning, and preparation of various military options. In a conflict of this scale, that is standard operational preparation. Preparation is not invasion. Positioning is not combat. The threshold between pre-positioning assets for potential future operations and the actual initiation of ground combat operations is a significant one, and credible reporting from the theater has not confirmed that threshold has been crossed. The third category of misinformation worth flagging is the presentation of real-time casualty figures as comprehensive or final. Casualty documentation in an active conflict requires physical assessment, medical reporting, cross-referencing between field reports and hospital records, and security and political review before figures are publicly released. That process takes time. The figures circulating in real time are always incomplete, often significantly lower than eventual confirmed totals. That delay is not evidence of a cover-up. It is evidence of the normal timeline of casualty documentation under active fire. What would be evidence of a cover-up is a pattern of official figures that remains static for weeks while independent reporting consistently documents higher numbers. That pattern has been documented throughout this conflict and is worth keeping in your awareness. The military strikes exchanged between Israel and Iran this morning exist within a larger strategic framework that most of the coverage is treating as a separate story. It is not a separate story. It is the same story at a higher level of consequence. Iran closed the Strait of Hormuz at the onset of this conflict. Approximately 20% of the world's oil supply transits through that 21-mile-wide passage at the mouth of the Persian Gulf on any given day. The closure triggered a global energy supply disruption significant enough that multiple nations immediately began drawing down strategic oil reserves. The economies of every country that runs on oil-powered transportation, manufacturing, and agriculture, which is to say, every major economy on Earth, absorbed an immediate shock. Trump issued an ultimatum: reopen the strait fully within 48 hours, or face strikes on Iranian power plants. Iran's response was not compliance. It was escalation. Tehran declared its intention to irreversibly annihilate critical infrastructure throughout the Middle East, including essential water systems across the Gulf, if the U.S. carried through on that threat. Iran then used long-range missiles, deployed for the first time in the conflict, to strike targets in southern Israel, including sites near the Shimon Peres Negev Nuclear Research Center in Dimona. Trump subsequently delayed his ultimatum by 5 days, claiming Iran was engaged in negotiations. Iranian officials denied that characterization. The strait remains a contested pressure point, and both sides are now threatening exactly the category of civilian infrastructure: energy, water, food, whose destruction does not produce a quick military resolution. It produces a humanitarian crisis that outlasts whatever military objectives either side was trying to achieve. Here's the thing about this conflict that should concern you more than any individual strike event, any specific damage claim, or any daily casualty figure. Nobody watching this conflict, not from Washington, not from Jerusalem, not from Tehran, not from any of the Allied capitals managing their exposure to the fallout, has identified the force that is going to stop it from escalating further. Every exchange of strikes in this conflict has produced pressure for the next exchange to be larger, more comprehensive, and more willing to cross thresholds that the previous exchange had carefully avoided. That is the definition of an escalation dynamic. And escalation dynamics do not have natural stopping points. The strikes launched from Iran against Israeli territory have been growing in sophistication throughout the conflict's duration. Cluster munitions added to ballistic missiles, specifically to defeat layered air defense systems, long-range missile deployments targeting sites that have never previously been targeted, coordinated launch packages designed to hit multiple categories of critical infrastructure simultaneously. Each of these represents a deliberate escalation of both capability and intent. The Israeli and American campaign against Iran has escalated in parallel. 11 waves of strikes on Tehran have hit regime command centers, missile systems, and Revolutionary Guard compounds. The Bushehr nuclear power plant has been struck 3 times. Threats against Iran's power grid, which would affect tens of millions of civilians, have been made at the presidential level. The economic consequences are accumulating in every capital simultaneously. The Strait of Hormuz closure is not just a military lever, it is a weapon aimed at the global economy, and it is landing. The energy price shocks, the supply chain disruptions, the diplomatic pressure building from nations that have no involvement in this conflict, but are absorbing its economic consequences, all of that is creating political pressure that the parties are managing but have not yet been forced to respond to at the level of strategic decision-making. What changes this calculus, what produces the pause, the negotiation, or the shift in strategic direction, does not live inside the individual strike events. It lives in the political and economic pressures accumulating in rooms far from the strike zones. It lives in the conversations happening between governments that have thus far stayed out of the direct exchange. It lives in the moment when one side's leadership calculates that the cost of the next escalation outweighs the perceived gain, or when external pressure becomes impossible to manage without stopping. That moment has not arrived yet. The trajectory is still upward, and every vital system that millions of civilians on both sides depend on, water, power, food, medicine, is increasingly within the scope of what is being deliberately targeted. The question is not what was hit this morning. The question is whether anyone on Earth has the power to stop what comes next. And right now, the honest answer is that nobody is sure. Drop your thoughts in the comments. If both sides have strong incentives to shape what you believe about the damage, and the information gap is always widest precisely when the stakes are highest, how do you actually figure out what is true? And at what point does the escalation toward civilian infrastructure create consequences so large that both sides are forced to stop, regardless of whether either one has achieved anything it set out to achieve? Let me know below. Subscribe and like the video if you want to stay updated, and hit the video on screen to keep watching.